Iconic is a word that is often overused, applicable to film, media, athletics, historical figures, and even moments in time. It is so often misused that it's almost lost all meaning. In this regard, video games are no exception. There are a litany of video games that are given the moniker of iconic by publications, websites, and comment sections. And while a word like iconic carries a certain amount of subjectivity, in my opinion, most of these games do not deserve the title which is bestowed upon them. Grand Theft Auto Vice City, however, does belong in this category. In fact, the GTA series itself could arguably be called iconic. Now, in my opinion, there are two other entries in the series that I think are better from a pure gaming perspective, one of which I've already covered and another I will surely cover in the future. That being said, Vice City is still an outstanding sandbox adventure game, and one of the finest PS2 games ever made, which is a testament to the quality of the series as a whole. Still, while I'd subjectively bestow the bronze medal around Vice City's sun-kissed neck in terms of pure quality, I can almost objectively proclaim Vice City the most iconic game in the franchise, which would mean that it keeps rare company in the small but exclusive pantheon of truly iconic, groundbreaking video games. So why Vice City? What was it about the game that made it so iconic? And, being iconic aside, why is it just a fantastic game overall? Let's find out. I've gone over the history of the GTA series to some degree in my Grand Theft Auto 4 retrospective, so I'm not going to spend too much time going over it here. Instead, I'm going to focus briefly on the leap between GTA 3 and Vice City before getting into the meat of the game. Grand Theft Auto 3 was the first fully 3D GTA game. It was released on the 22nd of October 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and was met with a myriad of acclaim, fan adoration, media fascination, and a ton of controversy in regards to the violent nature of the game. Moreover, GTA 3 became the template for every other GTA game that will precede it to this day, and will likely remain so for generations to come, if not indefinitely. The open world, mission structure, crime-driven storyline, music, humour, and the ability to freely roam around causing havoc with an arsenal of weapons and vehicles was revolutionary for the time. There hadn't really been anything else like it, and its influence on the medium ensured countless imitators, as well as securing the legacy of the series forever. However, what GTA 3 lacked was soul. So incredibly groundbreaking were the physical gameplay elements that many of the game's flaws were simply overlooked. And all of GTA 3's flaws, or at least most of them, have in some way to do with its presentation. When people refer fondly to the map of GTA 3, most of the time it'll be to do with the playground aspect of it. The fact that for the first time you had a fully 3D open sandbox with a load of weapons and vehicles to play with. Very rarely will you ever hear people gush over the aesthetics of Liberty City, because in reality it's a drab, colourless maze of streets and horizontal boxes posing as skyscrapers, at least looking at it in hindsight. GTA 3 had its own unique vibe, to be sure, but so has every other GTA game since. The soundtrack too was relatively uninspired. Although there are some high-profile artists like Debbie Harry and Royce the 5'9", there are only a few really good songs that suit the ambience of the game. At the time, having a radio soundtrack you can scan through was amazing, if just for the novelty of it. That said, given how we now know how vital a GTA game's soundtrack is to its identity, it definitely makes the experience feel shallower in hindsight. Then there's the protagonist, Claude. Dressed in black and grey and literally unable to speak, Claude is a black hole where charisma goes to die. Designed as an avatar and an avatar only, he is a conduit used to complete missions and kill pedestrians, and nothing more, and is completely devoid of personality. The first trailer for Grand Theft Auto Vice City was released in May of 2002. The very first scene in the trailer is an upward shot of some palm trees being penetrated by blinding sunshine. What is made clear literally within the first 2 seconds of the trailer is that Rockstar and the Hauser brothers were not a company willing to rest on their laurels. GTA 3 was an unmitigated success, a phenomenon that came seemingly out of nowhere and that became embedded in popular culture almost overnight. Had Rockstar stuck to the fundamentals and completely ignored the flair, They easily could have sold tens of millions of more copies and gotten away with rehashing the same game at least one or two more times, because that's how popular the series had become. Instead, Rockstar actively chose to actively improve upon GTA 3's biggest weakness and showcase the improvements front and centre while promoting the sequel. As the trailer goes on, we see snapshots of the city, mainly focusing on its buildings and vehicles. The buildings are varied and often colourful, ranging from low-rise apartments to high-rises with rooftop pool parties to mansions to neon-lit multi-storey parking lots. From a vehicular standpoint, there were many shots of sports cars, typically drifting to a cool and cinematic stop. However, what stood out the most was the prominence of a yacht and the presence of a motorcycle, two vehicle types completely absent in GTA 3. In many ways, this trailer set out to be the aesthetic antithesis. I'm sure those two words together will just ear rape to anybody listening on headphones. This trailer set out to be the aesthetic antithesis of GTA 3. The next two trailers focused on two other areas where GTA 3 fell short: soundtrack and character. Granted, the first trailer did use Summer Madness by Kool and the Gang, which is a great song, but even GTA 3 had Push It to the Limit, a song which ironically would have suited Vice City a lot more thematically. My point is that even though the first trailer had a recognisable song, it didn't necessarily mean that GTA Vice City would feature an extensive licensed soundtrack. But when the next trailer featured I Ran So Far Away by Flock of Seagulls, and the third Al Nafish The Soul by Hashim Music, it became obvious that this was Rockstar's not so subtle way of forecasting the quality of the game's soundtrack. If you think this is me reading too much into it, then consider this. The very first trailer for Grand Theft Auto 4 didn't even feature a licensed song. That's how renowned the series had become for its soundtrack after just 2 games. They didn't need to prove anything then. These two trailers also focus more on character and player interaction, something that was completely lacking in the first trailer, which was either designed specifically to show off the environments or could only utilise a limited amount of footage from a game that was still relatively early in development. Either way, these two trailers are all about action. Within the first couple of seconds of the second trailer, we see a man in a blue Hawaiian shirt firing a pump-action shotgun from behind a car. We saw this man sporadically in the first trailer and probably could have deduced that he'd be the playable character. However, his status as protagonist is firmly established in these two trailers. We see him firing a variety of weapons, interacting with gangsters, intimidating people, driving boats and helicopters, and just sauntering around with the general air of a cool psychopath. Aside from this still unnamed protagonist, there is just a general atmosphere of vibrancy and intensity that permeates these trailers. Tables piled high with coke, nightclub dancing, gang warfare, shootouts, drug-fueled mansion tantrums, carjackings, scantily clad women of the night, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and gratuitous violence. Even the ending title for each of the trailers, multicoloured palm tree silhouetted scrolling texts reading Grand Theft Auto Vice City, served as a proclamation. This is Grand Theft Auto you all know mechanically, yes. However, this is Grand Theft Auto with style. This is Grand Theft Auto with cool. This is Grand Theft Auto with soul. And this is Grand Theft Auto with character. And indeed it was. Grand Theft Auto Vice City was released on the PS2 on October 29, 2002, a year later almost to the day after GTA 3 was released. The game's intent to distance itself aesthetically and atmospherically from GTA 3 is evident from the very first cutscene. Admittedly starting out in the New York-inspired Liberty City, Sonny Forelli, a prominent mob boss in Liberty City, along with his crew, are discussing the imminent release of one Tommy Vercetti from prison. They decide to send him down to Vice City to meet their contact down there, lawyer Ken Rosenberg, and to help Forelli cut in on the flourishing drug business in Vice City, away from the prying eyes of the mafia. It would also appear that Vercetti garnered somewhat of a reputation for violence in his hometown of Liberty City, so sending him away will avert fear in the neighbourhood and be better for business overall. As the melodies of Broken Wings by Mr. Mister fade away, and the Latin jazz beats of Mongo Santa Maria's Mama Papa 2 fade in, we're suddenly transported to Escobar International Airport in Vice City, where Rosenberg is waiting to take Vercetti to a major coke deal. When they arrive at the deal and attempt to hand over the cash for the white, they're suddenly ambushed by a group of heavily armed masked men, with everyone dying except Vercetti and Rosenberg, who just about manage to escape with their lives, but also empty-handed. Calling Sonny up, Tommy informs him of the situation. With Tony taking the news very badly to say the least, Vercetti tells him that he's going to get him the money, the coke, and the appendages of those who set him up. And with the end of this pleasant phone call, the seeds of the game's plot have been planted. We're on a mission to avenge the debts and monetary loss at the expense of the Forelli crime family. At least, that's how it starts off. One of the reasons why Vice City is so iconic is because it wears its influences so firmly on its sleeve. While Vice City draws inspiration from many different sources, two of the biggest are the film Scarface and Carlito's Way. We see the fingerprints of both these movies in the opening scene. Visually and thematically, it's all Scarface. Neon-soaked 1980s Miami with refugees dealing and killing to be on top. The relationship between Tommy and Ken, though, is basically plagiarized from Carlito's Way, with the recently freed Vercetti playing the hardened straight man to Rosenberg's nervous and erratic lawyer, which directly mirrors Carlito and David's relationship from that film. There are so many things that make this game so special, and principal among them is the city itself. By day, the sun-drenched skies illuminate palm trees and sleek sports cars, crystal clear sea sparkles to the point of being blinding, and a variety of pedestrians populate the streets, many donning appropriately skimpy attire in the heat. By night, much of the city is decorated in pink and blue neon, highlighting nightclubs, hotels, and nefarious businesses. The city is divided into two main islands connected by bridges, with two smaller islands sitting in between them. The East Island, where you start the game, is more indicative of the Miami most of us have seen on TV, filled with the aforementioned neon, strip clubs, hotels, bars, and a harbour filled with luxury yachts. The West Island is much grittier, containing all the city's ghettos, which house the warring Haitian and Cuban gangs. It's also the more industrial side of the city, and its downtown core is home to sleazy biker bars, where, you guessed it, the bikers hang out. The biggest attraction of Prawn Island, the city's northernmost island, is the Interglobal Studios, where some of the finest pornography is being filmed. The other middle island, south of Prawn Island, Starfish Island, is the home of the elite. Giant mansions, big pools, and gates to keep the peasants out. This is where aspiring criminals like Vercetti would hope to end up. What's great about this map is that it manages to be diverse while still remaining cohesive. So whether you're driving past the mansions on Starfish Island or the hoods of Little Haiti, it always manages to feel like the same city, even if the environments are totally different. This is a testament to the game's atmosphere, which completely dominates every facet of Vice City. And I mean that in the best possible way. The level design and visual presentation have a lot to do with this, but there is another factor which is equally, if not more important. So far, we've touched on the importance Rockstar placed on the soundtrack of Vice City in the build-up to the game's release. However, what we haven't discussed yet is just how extensive it is, and how vital it is to the overall ambience of the game. Now, with regards to the great debate over which Grand Theft Auto game has the best soundtrack, subjectively, you can make a valid argument for any one of them from this game onward. However, there is a strong case for Vice City in this discussion. When I look at GTA soundtracks, I always look at them from two vantage points. The first is in the abstract, as a collection of songs that you might listen to on a playlist or as part of a compilation album. The second is as an integral part of the experience, how the songs enhance the game's atmosphere and how they fit in cohesively with the game thematically, geographically, historically, etc. Looking at the soundtrack purely from a quality point of view, with no relation to the game, I simply cannot say that there has ever been a stronger, more varied collection of licensed tracks in any game in history, GTA or otherwise. The calibre of songs spread across multiple genres is so vast that I run the risk of simply listing half the songs in the entire game. Instead of doing that, I'm going to circle back a little bit and look at some of the tracks which aid in creating that GTA Vice City vibe the most, regardless of how I feel personally about their overall quality as compositions when compared to other tracks in the game, even though I like all the songs that I'm going to list off. Hall & Oates' Out of Touch is perhaps the most quintessentially 80s song ever written, and thus may be the game's quintessential track. Every time it comes on the radio, it feels like you're watching an interactive, playable episode of Miami Vice on your television. In a similar vein, 99 Luftballon by Nina has that air of Reagan-era American optimism in its catchy riffs, choruses, and heavy synth. For day cruising from mission to mission on your motorcycle, glam metal staples like Loverboy's Working for the Weekend and Alcatraz's God Bless video give you that shot of adrenaline. And then there's the classic 1980s power ballad, and you better believe Vice City is full of them. For atmosphere, it's hard to beat Juicy Fruit by Mtume, Keep On Loving You by Oreo Speedwagon, or Missing You by John Waite. Now, to reiterate, there is a difference between a track that really meshes with the game and enhances the whole vibe, and just a great song in any context. For example, I'm a big heavy metal fan, and I love me some 1980s thrash metal. Vice City has an incredible selection of hand-picked classic heavy metal tracks, and while I love listening to them when they come on, they're not as impactful upon hearing while playing Vice City as a glam rock track or a power ballad, even though I prefer listening to them from a purely musical perspective. With this kind of musical selectiveness, Vice City is in stiff competition with other games in the series, particularly San Andreas and GTA 4. Although it's still a viable contender for the title of most cohesive and suitable soundtrack. That being said, this was a short list of the tracks that I feel embellish the atmosphere of the game in a particularly effective way. I'm being very specific in which songs to highlight, but don't get it twisted, the litany of other awesome songs in the game absolutely make the overall experience more enjoyable. As I said, the list of really great songs is extensive, and in this regard, I really feel like Vice City is in a class of its own. I could almost list every track in the game, but here are just some of the highlights. The Breaks by Curtis Blow, Dance Hall Days by Wang Chung, Billie Jean and Wanna Be Startin' Something by Michael Jackson, Run to You by Bryan Adams, And the Beat Goes On by The Whispers, Bark at the Moon by Ozzy Osbourne, Raining Blood by Slayer, Peace Sells by Megadeth, Madhouse by Anthrax, Expansions by Lonnie Liston Smith, Africa by Toto, I Ran So Far Away by Flock of Seagulls, and Gold by Spandau Ballet. Now for context, these are just some of my personal favourites. The game is full of identifiable 80s powerhouses like this, and this is just a short list that reflects my own personal preferences. You'll also notice the various genres covered in the game: old school rap and R&B, pop, disco, new wave, hard rock and metal, soft rock, Latin jazz, among others. The game is almost 20 years old, and truthfully, I cannot think of any other game with a stronger soundtrack. Rockstar really went all out, and I cannot imagine how much the company would have had to dole out in royalties for all these bangers. So now that I've done my best to set the scene and establish the basic premise, let's get down to business. Tommy has to set out to find who ambushed him and Forelli's men in order to seek retribution and, more importantly, save his own life. Initially, Ken Rosenberg connects you to pretty much every supporting character, or mission giver to put it another way, in the first half of the game. In one of the first missions, he gives you an invitation to a yacht party hosted by Colonel Juan Garcia Cortez. Cortez is one of the more prominent mission givers in the whole game. He was also the one who set up the deal in which Tommy and his crew were ambushed. Although sincerely sorry for what transpired, Cortez is unwilling to simply reimburse Tommy the money he lost, and instead will require Tommy to work for him in exchange for money. The boat also acts as an informal introduction to a large majority of other supporting and minor characters. The most important of these, at least initially, are Kent Paul, Avi Carrington, and Ricardo Diaz. Tommy seeks out Kent Paul for information about the setup when Rosenberg tells him he's got an ear to the streets. Avery offers both men protection from thugs, while Ricardo Diaz provides gainful employment for Tommy, even though Tommy quickly suspects that Diaz may have been involved in the setup. The beauty of these characters is just how different they are from one another. One of the issues with GTA 3 was that many of its characters felt a little two-dimensional. In Vice City though, each character has their own unique, vibrant, and often crazy personality. Our lead, Tommy Vercetti, is a genuine psychopath only truly interested in feathering his own nest at the expense of others. However, he's got just enough cool and wit to make him an enjoyable protagonist. Ken Rosenberg is the high-strung Jewish lawyer who compulsively snorts cocaine, apparently in an attempt to further fuel his paranoia and anxiety. Cortez is a calm, almost sage-like criminal boss and colonel from South America, while Diaz is an insane, trigger-happy lunatic with a small man complex, almost like Cortez's diminutive evil twin. Avery is a property developer from Texas who dons a cowboy hat and spouts off southern idioms, while Kent Paul is a loudmouth Brit whose words speak infinitely louder than his actions. All of these characters have their own funny moments and lines of dialogue, making them all likeable or at the very least memorable. Ray Liotta, who voices Tommy Vercetti, isn't the only prominent voice actor either. Burt Reynolds voices Avery Carrington, Danny Dyer voices Ken Paul, and later in the game we'll hear performances from actors like Gary Busey, Danny Trejo, and even all-time great NFL linebacker Lawrence Taylor. It's only appropriate that a cast like this was brought in to voice what was, at the time, by far the most well-written script for the strongest cast of characters in the series. With our eclectic cast of characters now in place, let's talk about the gameplay and the missions. Fundamentally, Vice City plays very similarly to GTA 3. To simplify things, action is broken down into driving and combat, mostly armed. Most missions require you to drive from one point on the map to the other and kill someone for some reason. Vice City does a good job of spicing up the formula by varying up the environments, context, and the nature of the violence. There's also a certain uniformity to certain mission givers and employers that give their specific missions a unique feel. When doing work for Diaz or Cortez, it's usually serious business, using Vercetti in a hitman capacity or to retrieve some form of high-powered weaponry, intel, or vehicle. For example, one mission for Cortez, Sir Yes Sir, sees Tommy hijack a tank from the US Army on patrol, fighting through the soldiers and driving it to a lockup so Cortez can sell it to a buyer. One mission for Diaz, The Fastest Boat, sees Tommy steal a speedboat for the crazed, egotistical Kingpin simply because he heard that there was a boat faster than his own in Vice City. Pretty much every other mission for either man requires Tommy to assassinate someone. Highlights include one mission where you swoop in on some rival dealers via a helicopter, firing a mounted machine gun down on them, and a mission where you have to chase a former associate of Cortez through a penthouse and kill him, preferably with a chainsaw. Missions for Rosenberg and Avery tend to be a little more cerebral. One mission for Ken has you intimidating jurors in a trial for Forelli mob associate Giorgio Forelli by smashing up their vehicles with a hammer, while another for Avery sees you plant bombs on a construction site on land that he wants to acquire. But rather than getting your hands completely dirty, you use a remote-controlled helicopter to fly each individual bomb into the building, which makes it a unique, if somewhat challenging, objective. Another character that is introduced a little later in the game's first half is Lance Vance. An uneasy ally at first, Lance's brother Victor was killed in the same ambush in which Tommy's money was stolen, so he has his own vendetta against Diaz, who he also believes is responsible for the setup. Lance is pretty much the quintessential smooth-talking 1980s brother. Dressed all in white and driving a flashy sports car, he looks like something directly out of an R&B music video from that era. Character and personality was the key to Vice City's success from a story and presentation perspective. From a mission perspective, the key was variety, and this extended to the weapons at your disposal. In GTA 3 you had 14 weapons, including your fists. In Vice City you have 35, 2.5 times as many as its predecessor, which was released just a year earlier. You had 11 melee weapons, 2 handguns, 3 shotguns, 4 submachine guns, 2 assault rifles, 2 sniper rifles, 4 heavy weapons, meaning launchers and miniguns, 4 throwable weapons, and 2 special weapons, which were a camera and a remote control detonator. So plenty of toys to choose from. If you forego those now legendary GTA cheat codes, you'll come across these weapons organically, either in spawn points on the map or through certain missions. And while some players will opt to use the cheats for convenience, I have to say there is something special about a moment like when Lance opens up the trunk of his car at the beginning of a mission to reveal an arsenal of weapons that up until that point were not made available to the player, and knowing that you'll have the opportunity to use them once the cutscene ends. Although Vice City reinvented the series in terms of its presentation, sound design, aesthetic, and overall vibe, fundamentally the game did not take any huge evolutionary steps past GTA 3. Aside from some minor tweaks, like the ability to run and shoot while firing a small handful of the game's submachine guns and one pistol, as well as the ability to fire guns while riding cars and bikes, shooting feels basically the same. Combat in Vice City is very fun. However, I'm not sure even now how much of that has to do with the environments in which the action takes place. You can fire the same gun at a similar target in a similar situation in both GTA 3 and Vice City, but it's just more enjoyable in Vice City. I really believe that this has a lot to do with the window dressing in Vice City. We can break any game down and look at its core mechanics. That's relatively easy to do. However, I think things like a well-designed map, a cool protagonist, a cast of characters you enjoy interacting with, and a story you're eager to see develop all go a long way to enhancing a game's core mechanics. It makes it easier to embrace a game's qualities and forgive its weaknesses. The shooting in Vice City isn't necessarily a weakness either. More so, it's how its mechanics are implemented in relation to the world that can be more detrimental. The biggest and worst examples of this is a lack of any real form of cover. Now, it's true that dynamic cover mechanics were relatively rare in gaming at this time, although there were early examples of this going back as far as 1999 in Winback on the Nintendo 64. Truthfully, the implementation of dynamic cover wouldn't really be popularised or normalised to any major degree until 7th generation games like Gears of War and Uncharted. Even still, in a game that often requires you to engage in open shootouts with law enforcement or rival gangs, it's painfully evident as an omission, especially when viewed through modern eyes. Alright, so now that I've reached the part of the video where I'm going to shit on the game, let's go down the checklist of criticisms. As I said, Vice City and 3 play very similarly. Driving wise, this is forgivable, as driving in Vice City still feels fun today, and even feels a tiny bit tighter mechanically than GTA 3, as does the shooting now that I think about it. What is more unforgivable, however, is that Tommy can't swim. Now I understand that there are a lot of people who can't swim, I get it, but seeing Tommy fall off a pier, struggle for 3 seconds before floating lifelessly as the now infamous words "wasted" flash on the screen is just sad. Again, maybe the dude can't swim, but the fact that his body has a higher tolerance for absorbing bullets than his lungs do at absorbing water is just outrageous. What makes it worse is that a lot of missions require you to enter and exit boats on said piers, meaning that you'll often accidentally fail a mission by misjudging a jump on or off a boat. And given the fact that jumping physics have been something of an Achilles heel for Rockstar and Grand Theft Auto games, this doesn't make the situation any better. Also, we need to talk about the graphics. I already said that Vice City was an aesthetically pleasing game, and it is. The palm trees, sun, sea, and neon lights are all vessels of joy and nostalgia. However, when you look at the visuals without rose-tinted glasses, you'll see that in many ways, Vice City is an ugly, ugly game. Buildings have doors and windows badly painted on them. Roads and people and cars pop up mere feet ahead of you as you drive. And then there's the character models. The character models in GTA Vice City are among the ugliest things in the game. Even during cutscenes when the PS2 engine doesn't have to render multiple objects at once in real time, models move like they're half robotic. Faces look contorted and bizarre, and hands move up and down with fingers seemingly glued together, making me wonder how Vercetti or any of these characters are even able to fire a gun. Now before you say, hey, the game is almost 2 decades old, cut it some slack, consider this. The year before this game came out, Metal Gear Solid 2 Ico, and Final Fantasy X were released on the same console. And those visuals are still pleasing to the eye today. So even by the standards of the time, Vice City was visually underwhelming, to say the very least. Now, I understand that it's harder to render graphics for an open world game, given the fluid nature of the map and the changing environments. Even still, given how GTA 4 and 5 were able to at least hang in there visually with other titles of their generation, Vice City's graphics, at least when examined up close and not taken as a whole, remain one of the game's biggest weaknesses. But again, the beauty of Vice City is that these shortcomings are veiled by the game's strengths. If the script is well written and the characters are brilliantly voiced, it makes you care about them even if they look like they're made out of plasticine. If you're cruising down the highway listening to Juicy Fruit on a still night, it diminishes the fact that pedestrians appear out of nowhere in front of your car like Jesus. If one of your allies is kidnapped and being held hostage at a junkyard and you want to save him and seek retribution, it doesn't matter that the waves of enemies you're picking off collapse in the same cartoonish way after being shot. You see, that's the beauty of Vice City. It does what all good games from its and older generations did. It distracts you from its mechanical and visual shortcomings by drawing your attention to its strengths. Vice City has an identity, a vibe. It's a snapshot in history that's equal parts iconic homage and equal parts parody. Speaking of parody, this is another area where the game excels. Praise for the game's sound design cannot stop short of the music and performances of its main cast alone. The radio stations are filled with hilarious commercials that poke fun at 1980s American culture, with some exceptional dialogue. My favourites include the commercial for the action movie Exploder Evacuator Part 2, BJ Smith's Fit for Football videocassette, and the Pastor Richards fund. Speaking of Pastor Richards, he makes an appearance also on VCPR, one of 2 talk radio stations available for your listening pleasure. He's even funnier here than on his commercials, and has some truly golden lines. VCPR and K-Chat have some great guests between them, but for me the good pastor takes the cake. The humour spills out from the radio and into Versetti's supporting cast, which become even more comedic in the game's second half. But before we look at this in detail, let's look at the shift in the story from the perspective of Tommy and his own journey. Spoiler alert, after Lance Vance attempts to kill Ricardo Diaz, resulting in him getting kidnapped, you're forced to expedite your revenge for his role in the ambush and take him out yourself. Honestly though, you see this coming a mile away, as it is pretty much confirmed early on that Diaz had something to do with it all. After making your way through his mansion and disposing of him and some of his men, you take over his home, his remaining men, and his drug business. This is where Tommy's priorities shift from enacting revenge on behalf of the Mafia and compensating them for lost money and product, to taking over Vice City as the town's main kingpin. This is where one of the game's main features kicks in, and that's empire building. Now, to be fair, all empire building consists of is earning enough money to acquire various businesses throughout the city, and then collecting money from that business every few days. And even though a much deeper and complex version of this can be found on the highly underrated PSP game Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories, it really adds to the immersion of the experience and was actually kind of groundbreaking at the time. Most of the businesses you buy require you to perform 1 or 2 missions in order to start earning revenue from them. Admittedly, some of these missions are pretty basic and uninspired, like selling drugs while being undercover as an ice cream van driver as you're being chased by junkies and cops. That said, there are a few businesses which provide some really cool subplots and corresponding missions. The best of these are the Malibu Club missions. After paying top dollar for the club, Tommy starts to plan a bank heist and needs to assemble a crew for the job. Ken, now coked out of his mind, gives Tommy the names of a safecracker, a shooter, and a getaway driver. This sets up 3 missions where Tommy must attempt to get all these men on board for the job, the best of which requires Tommy to spring Cam, the safecracker, from prison. It also happens to be one of the game's most difficult and frustrating missions, but still a pretty cool concept for a side mission. Speaking of which, quick detour here. Some of the missions in GTA Vice City have high difficulty spikes, and a lot of this is down to the somewhat primitive gameplay mechanics. This is something that they rectified in the next game, GTA San Andreas, which may be the best game in the series in terms of difficulty balance. That said, there are no missions in the game that feel completely unbeatable, and feel significantly less daunting than GTA 3, which had some genuinely horrific missions from a difficulty spike perspective. Buying up businesses not only helps immerse the player in the story, but acquiring a certain amount of assets is actually required to move the story forward. And contextually, this makes sense. Remember, at this point in the game, Tommy has essentially become a sober Tony Montana, going into business for himself, with his new goal now being to become the top dog in Vice City. The main missions also reflect this. Whereas before you were doing grunt work for the Underground's more influential players, now you're in a position of control. Missions from your mansion, now at the behest of Lance, who can't seem to do anything for himself, involve racketeering and intimidation, shaking down criminals and businesses for protection money, that kind of thing. Tommy also puts in work for the Cuban gangs after Umberto Robina tries to call Tommy on the cell phone that he stole from Leo the chef after killing him at the start of the game. Umberto and his Cuban gang are some of the funniest characters in the game, and are all about the machismo. They also provide some of the funniest missions in the game. The first mission requires Tommy to drive a speedboat through a number of checkpoints to prove his masculinity to Umberto. And while this alone is fun enough, the commentary provided by Rico, one of Umberto's boys, is what makes it so entertaining. Now, we already talked about the humour heard on the radio stations and its satire of Americana, but now I want to talk about the comical nature of the game's characters. More specifically, how Vice City deals with stereotypes. Now, this is not a political channel. There are plenty of those on YouTube, and in an era where politics, identity or otherwise, are extremely prevalent, I'd rather not bring that energy to my videos. That being said, when I went back and played some of Vice City while writing this script, it was refreshing to hear different cultures and ethnicities being satirized and actually, frankly, just plain made fun of. And GTA Vice City pokes fun at everyone. Italian Americans, African Americans, Cubans, Haitians, South Americans, White America, Redneck America, Ghetto America, religious fundamentalists, right-wing zealotry, left-wing ignorance, homosexuality, the Cockney English, the French, etc, etc. What I love about Vice City's take on all these groups is that it turns them all into caricatures. This is not a clever social commentary, even if Rockstar would like to think it is. These are stereotypes at their most cartoonish, and the game is all the better for it. Again, without politicising anything, it was just nice to have a sophomoric chuckle at a joke which, at the time, would have been viewed as innocuous, maybe even good-natured, if a little immature. So aside from building your drug-fueled empire and negotiating some of Vice City's most incendiary personalities, what else is there to do in this game? Well, a lot actually, as Vice City is full of extracurricular activities. Not even mentioning all the collectible items around the city, there are a litany of side missions in which you can complete. Perhaps the best of all are the assassination missions. Activated by answering payphones throughout the city, an anonymous employer named Mr. Black will assign you targets for you to take out. You find these targets in a variety of different locations and situations, meaning you have to apply a different strategy in eliminating each one. One mission requires you to snipe a heavily secured businessman from a distance at an airport, while another requires you to ram a woman off-road in her car, making her death look like an accident. So popular were these assassination missions that they have appeared in some incarnation in every main entry in the series up until now. Other enjoyable side missions are the car acquisitions for Sunshine Autos. After buying the business, you can steal a number of cars for former tight end BJ Smith, who's the face of the company. Finding them all is a big undertaking, and while I never managed to do it myself, it's the kind of side quest that die-hard fans love to sink their teeth into. Aside from these, there are the classic police, cab, firefighter and ambulance side missions, and so many more that I'm not going to detail them all here. Needless to say, for the completionists, Vice City is the kind of game that will keep you busy for quite some time. When the game's story comes to its satisfying, if somewhat predictable conclusion, what will its lasting impression on you be? For me, it was the sense that Grand Theft Auto Vice City is a snapshot in time. A wonderfully over-the-top, highly embellished snapshot in time. Grand Theft Auto Vice City is an extreme caricature of 1980s Americana. Everything present here, from the music to the fashion, to the cars, to the advertisements, to the characters themselves, are so incredibly bombastic and over the top, and all have that uniquely 80s tinge to them. The 1980s was an iconic era, but far from a perfect one. While it was a time of optimism, patriotism, and creativity, it was also a time of excess and avarice, and superficiality. All of this is encompassed in Vice City. The game borrows the iconicness of the era in which it draws its inspiration. However, what truly makes it special is not so much how it implements 1980s culture into its world, but how it exaggerates it, how it twists it and warps it in its own unique image, and how it places its characters into this world. An open world of destruction, a playground you can run around in, killing and maiming whoever you please, all while listening to REO Speedwagon. That's what makes Grand Theft Auto a classic game, and one of the most iconic in gaming history.